"You're making a mistake." The words hung in the sterile air of the HR office like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Claire Sullivan sat on the edge of a gray fabric-covered chair that smelled faintly of stale coffee and the sweat of 100 other people who had sat in this exact spot waiting to hear the worst news of their professional lives. She kept her hands folded in her lap, pressing her palms together so hard that her knuckles ached, because if she didn't, everyone in this room would see what she was desperately trying to hide. These hands were shaking. These were hands that had once held a dying Marine's artery, shut on a dusty road in Fallujah, while mortar shells rained down around her like hellfire from an angry god. Hands that had performed emergency surgery on the hood of a burning Humvee in the middle of an ambush with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer. Hands that had steadied nervous fathers in the delivery room and held the fingers of cancer patients as they took their final breaths. These hands had saved more lives than Claire could count, in more impossible situations than most people could imagine. But right now, facing the smirking face of Dr. Jonathan Blackwood and the cold bureaucratic stare of HR Director Karen Walsh, those hands felt completely and utterly useless. The fluorescent lights above hummed with a headache-inducing buzz that seemed specifically designed to break the human spirit, and Claire couldn't help but think that this was appropriate because that's exactly what was happening here. Her spirit was being broken piece by piece, word by word, as Karen Walsh tapped a manicured fingernail on the manila folder in front of her without bothering to look up at the woman whose life she was about to destroy. Insubordination. Karen said, her voice as flat and emotionless as a computer reading a grocery list. Gross misconduct, violation of hospital hierarchy protocols, failure to follow proper chain of command during a critical medical event. She finally looked up, but her eyes were devoid of any warmth, any empathy, any recognition that she was speaking to a human being, and not a piece of malfunctioning equipment that needed to be discarded. "The list is extensive, Miss Sullivan." Claire took a breath, and the air tasted of recycled antiseptic and the faint chemical smell of industrial cleaning products. She had breathed this air for 20 years. She had given her entire adult life to this hospital, to these hallways, to the patients who came through those emergency room doors, broken and bleeding and terrified. And now, she was being thrown away like yesterday's surgical waste. "I saved the patient," Claire said, and she hated how her voice cracked on the words, hated how it made her sound weak when she was anything but. "The boy Leo. He's 8 years old. He's alive right now because of what I did. If I hadn't administered that epinephrine when I did, while Dr. Blackwood was still on the phone debating insurance authorization with the legal department, that child would be in the morgue instead of at home with his mother." Dr. Jonathan Blackwood shifted in his chair, and Claire forced herself to really look at him, even though it made her stomach turn. He was a man who wore his stethoscope like a piece of expensive jewelry, rather than a tool for saving lives draped artfully around his neck, as if it were a fashion accessory. His silver hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his Rolex caught the fluorescent light every time he moved his wrist. He was the chief of surgery at St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital, a man whose family name was plastered on the new oncology wing in letters 3 feet tall and whose ego took up more space in any room than all the furniture combined. "You undermined my authority in a critical trauma situation," Blackwood said. And his voice was smooth, practically oily, like something slick and dangerous that you wouldn't want to touch with bare hands. "You are a nurse, Claire. A highly paid nurse, perhaps even an overqualified nurse, but a nurse nonetheless. You do not make decisions. You execute orders. That is the natural hierarchy of medicine, and it exists for a reason." He leaned forward slightly, and there was something in his eyes that made Claire's blood run cold. A flicker of something that went beyond professional disapproval into something personal, something vindictive. "When you pushed past me to access that crash cart, when you physically moved me aside to administer medication without my authorization, you created a hostile work environment. You embarrassed me in front of my staff. I created a heartbeat." Claire snapped, and she felt her composure cracking like ice under too much pressure. His throat was closing up. He was in anaphylaxis. His face was turning blue, and his mother was screaming, and you were on the phone with the legal department discussing liability and insurance coverage, while an 8-year-old boy suffocated 3 feet away from you. That is enough." Karen Walsh cut in with the precision of a scalpel, and her voice was sharp enough to draw blood. "The decision has been made, Miss Sullivan. Dr. Blackwood has formally requested your termination, and the hospital board has approved it effective immediately. We are revoking your access to the electronic medical records system as we speak. Security is waiting outside this door to escort you to your locker so you can collect your personal belongings. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, pressing down on Claire's chest like a physical weight. 20 years. 20 years of her life reduced to a single conversation in a room that smelled like fear and failure. Claire looked at Blackwood, and he offered her a small, triumphant smile. It was the smile of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life and wasn't about to start tolerating it from a 44-year-old trauma nurse with a mortgage and a bad back, and the audacity to believe that saving a child's life was more important than hospital politics. Then he said something that made her freeze, something that turned her blood to ice and then immediately to fire. "You always were reckless," Claire Blackwood said softly, almost gently, as if he were sharing a secret between old friends. Even back when Michael was alive. The mention of her dead husband hit Claire like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't do anything except stare at the man who had just casually invoked the name of the person she had loved most in this world. Michael had been dead for 14 years, and Blackwood had no right to speak his name, no right to use her grief as a weapon against her. The only mistake, Blackwood said, standing up and buttoning his pristine white coat with the casual confidence of a man who knew he had already won, was thinking you were indispensable. The walk from the HR office to her locker was a blur. A haze of fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes that had carried her through these hallways thousands of times before. Claire moved on autopilot, her body knowing the route, even as her mind struggled to process what had just happened, and she found herself thinking about another time, another place, when she had walked through chaos with the same numb detachment. She was passing the trauma bay when it hit her a wave of memory so powerful and so vivid that for a moment she wasn't in St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital at all. She was 25 years old again, and she was in hell. Fallujah, Iraq. November 2005. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning oil and the copper tang of blood, so much blood that it seemed to coat everything: the ground, the vehicles, the hands of Staff Sergeant Claire Sullivan, as she fought to save a life while the world exploded around her. The convoy had been ambushed on a routine patrol, IEDs, detonating in a chain reaction that turned 3 armored vehicles into twisted metal coffins in the span of seconds. Claire had been in the 4th vehicle, and she was already moving before the ringing in her ears had stopped, because that's what combat medics did. They moved. They didn't think about the mortars still falling, or the small arms fire crackling through the air like deadly fireworks. They just moved because every second of hesitation was a second that someone was bleeding out. Corporal Danny Reeves was lying in the dust. His legs shattered his throat, filling with blood from shrapnel that had torn through his neck and left him gasping like a fish pulled from water. Claire had dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving, already assessing, already knowing what she had to do. Even as her brain screamed that it was impossible, that she didn't have the equipment, that she didn't have the time. "Stay with me, Danny." She had said, her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. "I need you to stay with me." She had performed the cricothyrotomy right there in the dust and the blood and the chaos cutting into his throat to create an airway while mortars fell close enough to shower them both with debris. There was no sterile operating room, no surgical team, no fancy equipment. There was just Claire and her training and her absolute refusal to let another soldier die on her watch. Danny had lived. He had gone home to his wife and his newborn daughter, and 3 years later he had sent Claire a photo of that little girl taking her first steps with a note that said simply, "She exists because of you." Claire blinked and she was back in the hallway of St. Matthew's, standing outside the trauma bay, with her hand pressed against the wall for support. Her heart was racing, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead, and for just a moment, she had been so completely back in that desert that she could taste the dust on her tongue. She had thought she left Staff Sergeant Sullivan behind when she traded her uniform for scrubs when she came home from the war and tried to build a normal life with Michael. She had thought that soldier was buried, gone, just a ghost from a past she didn't talk about. But standing here now with her career in ruins and her life falling apart, Claire realized that ghost had never left. That soldier was still inside her, still ready to move when everyone else froze. Still willing to break the rules when the rules meant letting someone die. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe you couldn't bury something that was so fundamentally a part of who you were. Maybe Staff Sergeant Sullivan had just been waiting dormant for the moment when the nurse wasn't enough, when the soldier needed to take over again. Claire pushed herself off the wall and continued walking toward her locker. She had a box to pack and a life to figure out, and standing in a hallway feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to help anyone. The locker was small and dented with a combination lock that stuck if you didn't jiggle it just right, and Claire had opened it 10,000 times over the past 2 decades without ever really thinking about what was inside. Now, as she twisted the dial with trembling fingers, she found herself cataloging the contents of her professional life with the detached precision of someone inventorying the belongings of the dead. The stethoscope came first. It was a Littman Classic 3 burgundy colored, and it had been a wedding gift from Michael. He had given it to her the morning after their honeymoon, pressing the small velvet box into her hands over breakfast at a diner in Cape Cod, and when she had opened it and seen what was inside, she had burst into tears. "For all the hearts you're going to save," he had said, grinning at her with that crooked smile that always made her knees weak. "Starting with mine." She placed the stethoscope in the cardboard box that Mr. Patterson had silently handed her, and it made a soft thud against the bottom that seemed far too final. The framed photograph came next, and this one was harder, so much harder that Claire had to stop for a moment and just breathe through the pain of it. Michael smiled up at her from behind the glass, frozen forever. At 32 years old in his army dress uniform, with his dark hair neatly combed, and his brown eyes full of the warmth and humor that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. He had been so young in this photo, so full of life, so completely unaware, that in just 3 years, he would be dead on an operating table at a VA hospital, while doctors who should have saved him made mistakes that cost him everything. Claire had always suspected that there was more to Michael's death than a simple surgical complication. The way the hospital had so stonewalled her questions, the way certain files had gone missing, the way no one would look her in the eye when she demanded answers. But she had never been able to prove anything, and eventually the grief had been too heavy to carry along with the weight of her suspicions, so she had let it go. Or at least, she had tried to. Her military dog tags were at the bottom of the locker, hidden in the back corner, behind a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen and a ceramic mug that said, "Nurses call the shots," in cheerful pink letters. She hadn't looked at those dog tags in 17 years, hadn't wanted to be reminded of who she used to be. But now, she reached for them and held them in her palm, feeling the cool metal against her skin. Sullivan, Claire M. O positive. Catholic. Such simple information to represent such a complicated history. Wars fought lives, saved friends, lost a self transformed and then buried, and now apparently resurrected against her will. She dropped the dog tags into the box with everything else. Mr. Patterson stood nearby, his security guard uniform slightly too tight around his middle. His kind face creased with the discomfort of a man who was being asked to do something that went against every instinct in his body. He had been the head of security at St. Matthew's for almost as long as Claire had been a nurse here, and over the years they had developed the easy friendship of people who worked the same late shifts and shared the same bad coffee in the break room at 3 in the morning. "This ain't right, Claire," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid that someone might overhear him expressing sympathy for the woman he was supposed to be escorting out like a criminal. "Everyone knows it. Everyone's talking about what you did for that boy. You saved his life." Claire managed a weak smile, even though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "Watch that blood pressure, Pat. I won't be here to check it anymore." She walked through the trauma ward one last time, her cardboard box clutched against her chest, and the silence that greeted her was worse than any insult could have been. Jessica and Maria and David, nurses she had worked beside for years. Nurses she had trained and mentored and covered for. When they needed to leave early for their kids' school plays, none of them would meet her eyes. They stared at their charts at their screens at the floor, anywhere except at the woman who was being marched out of the building for the crime of caring more about a patient's life than a doctor's ego. Claire didn't blame them. She understood with the bitter clarity that comes from experience that this was how institutions worked. Blackwood had the power, and anyone who challenged that power would be next on the chopping block. Fear was a more effective silencer than any gag order, and these people had families to feed, mortgages to pay, lives that depended on their continued employment. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. She was almost at the exit when she passed Blackwood's office, and something made her slow down, made her look through the glass window at the wall of photographs and certificates that decorated his professional throne room. There, in a heavy gilded frame, was a photo she had never noticed before: Blackwood, shaking hands with a group of men in military uniforms. all smiles and patriotic pride. And suddenly, Claire remembered something that made her blood run cold. The surgeon who had operated on Michael, the one who had made the mistakes that killed him, had trained under Blackwood. She had known this somewhere in the back of her mind, but she had never connected the dots, never allowed herself to follow that thread to its logical conclusion. But now, standing here with her career in ruins, she couldn't help but wonder. Had Blackwood been watching her all these years? Had he been waiting for her to slip up to give him an excuse to get rid of her before she started asking questions again? Had her husband's death been something more than a tragic accident? Claire shook her head and kept walking. She was being paranoid. She was looking for conspiracies where there were only coincidences trying to make sense of senseless tragedy by imposing a narrative that probably didn't exist. But the thought stayed with her, a cold kernel of suspicion lodged in her chest, as she walked through the automatic glass doors of the emergency department entrance and stepped out into the October rain. The cold hit her first, a blast of October air that cut through her thin scrubs like they weren't even there. And then came the rain, a gray and relentless drizzle that seemed determined to wash away whatever dignity she had left. Of course it was raining. Of course the universe had decided that losing her job wasn't punishment enough, that she needed to be cold and wet and miserable on top of everything else. Mr. Patterson had stopped at the threshold of the building, unable or unwilling to follow her out into the storm, and Claire heard the automatic doors slide shut behind her with a soft whoosh that sounded like a coffin closing. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, blinking raindrops out of her eyes, trying to figure out what to do next. Her car was in the shop, a transmission issue that she had been putting off for months because she couldn't afford to fix it, and now she definitely couldn't afford to fix it because she was unemployed, and her savings account had maybe 3 months of expenses in it if she was careful. She would have to walk to the train station 8 blocks away in the pouring rain, carrying a cardboard box full of memories that were rapidly getting soaked. Claire started walking. Boston moved around her with the indifferent rhythm of a city that had seen 10,000 tragedies and would see 10,000 more. Taxis splashed dirty water onto the curbs without slowing down. Businessmen with expensive umbrellas rushed past, checking their watches, talking into phones, completely oblivious to the blonde woman in soggy blue scrubs who was shuffling along the sidewalk like a ghost. No one looked at her. No one saw her. She had become invisible, just another piece of human wreckage washed up on the shores of a city that didn't care. She clutched the cardboard box tighter, trying to shield Michael's photograph from the rain, but the box was already getting soft and wet, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it fell apart completely. Just like everything else in her life, the weight of the box seemed to grow heavier with every step, as if all those years of memories were physically pressing down on her, and Claire found herself replaying the scene with Leo over and over in her mind, trying to figure out what she could have done differently, whether there was some way she could have saved the boy without ending her own career. Leo had come into the emergency room gasping, his small hands clutching at his throat, his face turning a terrifying shade of blue that Claire had seen too many times in her life. Bee sting allergy, severe anaphylactic reaction, and his airway was closing up so fast that every second felt like an hour. His mother had been screaming that awful, helpless scream of a parent watching their child die, and the sound had cut through Claire like a knife. Blackwood had hesitated. He had looked at Leo's chart, seen some note about a pre-existing heart condition, and instead of doing the one thing that could save this child's life, he had pulled out his phone and called the legal department to discuss liability and insurance coverage. Claire had seen the light fading from Leo's eyes. She had watched his lips turn blue and his small body start to convulse, and something inside her had snapped. She hadn't thought. She hadn't weighed the consequences. She had simply moved, pushing past Blackwood, grabbing the epinephrine, administering the injection that saved Leo's life. And now, she was walking in the rain with the cardboard box, unemployed. Unemployable, her reputation about to be destroyed by a man who valued his ego more than a child's life. Maybe I should have just let him handle it. Claire muttered to the wet pavement, and she hated herself for even thinking it, but the thought was there, poisonous and persistent. Maybe I'm just an old soldier who doesn't know how to stop fighting battles that aren't mine to fight. She was 3 blocks away from the hospital now, crossing the bridge over the Charles River, and she paused for a moment to look down at the dark water churning below. Not because she was thinking about jumping, nothing like that, but because she needed to stop, needed to catch her breath, needed to feel something other than the numb despair that was threatening to swallow her whole. She looked down at the box at the soggy cardboard that was starting to disintegrate in her hands, and she thought about Michael. "What would you do, Mike?" she whispered, and the rain swallowed her words almost before they left her lips. "You always said I was too stubborn. You always said I'd get in trouble someday for refusing to play by the rules. Michael would have done the same thing." She knew that with absolute certainty. He had been a combat medic too, had served in the same unit, had lived by the same code: you save the life in front of you, and you worry about the paperwork later. That's why she had loved him. That's why losing him had nearly destroyed her. "This is it, isn't it?" Claire said, still talking to a photograph that couldn't hear her. To a husband who had been dead for 14 years. "This is how it ends." Not with a bang, but with wet cardboard and a train ride to an empty apartment. She wiped the rain from her face, although it was pointless, because more rain immediately took its place, and she started walking again. She had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, everything was about to change. Claire was still on the bridge when she felt a change in the air that had nothing to do with the rain or the cold, or the wind whipping off the Charles River. It started as a vibration, something she felt in her chest before she heard it. With her ears, a deep thrumming pulse that seemed to resonate in her bones. She stopped walking and looked down at the puddles forming on the sidewalk. They were rippling, but not from the rain. The ripples were rhythmic concentric circles spreading outward in a pattern that matched the strange vibration she could feel in her chest. Then she noticed the storefronts to her left, the windows rattling in their frames, the glass humming with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The sound came next, rising above the noise of traffic and rain and city life, like thunder rolling in from a distant storm. But this wasn't thunder. Thunder was random, chaotic, unpredictable. This sound was rhythmic, mechanical, purposeful. Thwop, 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 thwop. Claire knew that sound. She had heard it 100 times in the deserts of Iraq, had learned to distinguish between friendly birds and enemy fire by the specific pitch and rhythm of rotor blades cutting through the air. This was the sound of helicopters, big ones, military ones, and they were coming in fast and low. She looked up at the gray October sky, squinting against the rain, and watched as the clouds seemed to tear apart like tissue paper. Two shapes emerged from the gloom, black against the gray, descending toward the city, with the speed and aggression that made no sense for civilian aircraft. UH-60 Blackhawks. Military transport helicopters painted in matte black, with no visible markings or insignia, flying so low that Claire could see the rivets on their underbellies. They banked hard over the Charles River, their rotors kicking up spray from the water below, and the downdraft hit the street like a physical force, sending trash cans rolling and snapping umbrellas inside out, and knocking more than a few pedestrians off their feet. Around Claire, chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered, running for cover, certain that they were witnessing a terrorist attack, or a military operation gone wrong, or some other catastrophe that would be leading the evening news. Cars slammed on their brakes, causing a chain reaction of screeching tires and honking horns and minor fender benders that would keep insurance adjusters busy for weeks. But Claire didn't run. 20 years of trauma nursing had trained her to freeze and assess, not flee. Panic killed people. Panic made you run into traffic or trip over your own feet or make decisions that turned a bad situation into a fatal one. So she stood her ground, her soaked scrubs plastered to her body, her soggy cardboard box clutched against her chest, and she watched the helicopters with the professional detachment of a soldier evaluating a tactical situation. The lead Blackhawk didn't head for the hospital helipad, which was several blocks behind her. It didn't veer toward Logan Airport or any of the other logical landing zones in the area. Instead, it slowed into a hover directly over the intersection of Commonwealth Avenue and Exeter Street, approximately 30 feet from where Claire was standing, and began to descend with a precision that spoke of exceptional piloting skill. The aircraft was landing in the middle of a busy intersection during rush hour, threading between traffic lights and power lines and stopped vehicles, and the pilot was executing this insane maneuver as casually as someone parallel parking a sedan. The skids touched down on the asphalt with barely a bump, the rotors still spinning at full speed, slicing the air just feet above the heads of the terrified motorists who had abandoned their cars and were now pressing themselves against buildings and vehicles, trying to get as far away from the mechanical monsters as possible. The second helicopter remained in the air, hovering overhead in a position that Claire's military training immediately recognized as Overwatch. She could see a figure in the side door, a sniper, with a rifle scanning the crowd with the patient vigilance of a predator waiting for prey. This wasn't a crash landing or an emergency situation. This was a deliberate, planned extraction. And then the side door of the landed helicopter slid open and everything changed. 3 men jumped out of the helicopter before it had even fully settled their boots, hitting the wet asphalt in perfect synchronization, and Claire immediately recognized their gear and bearing as military special operations. Not police, SWAT, not National Guard, not any of the domestic law enforcement agencies that might conceivably have a reason to land a helicopter in the middle of Boston. These were the real deal. Tier 1 operators, the kind of men who didn't officially exist and did things that would never appear in any public record. They wore dark tactical gear with no insignia or identifying marks, just matte black and olive drab, and the dull gleam of assault rifles strapped to their chests. They moved with the coordinated precision of a unit that had trained together for years, fanning out to secure a perimeter around the helicopter, while scanning the panicked crowd with professional detachment. But the man in the lead wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a tablet, some kind of ruggedized military computer, and he was staring at the screen with an expression of barely controlled urgency. He looked up, scanning the terrified faces around him, dismissing each one in turn, with rapid flicks of his eyes, searching for something. Someone with a desperation that seemed completely at odds with his calm professional bearing. Claire watched him spin in a circle, his gaze sweeping across the chaos, and then his eyes locked onto her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Claire stood there in her soaked blue scrubs, clutching her soggy cardboard box like a shield. Her blonde hair plastered to her face, looking nothing like whoever or whatever this man was searching for. She was just a fired nurse walking home in the rain and nobody. A piece of human flotsam cast adrift by the machinery of institutional politics. But the soldier's eyes widened with something that looked almost like relief, and he started sprinting toward her, dodging around a stopped taxi and hurtling over the hood of a sedan whose driver had abandoned it in the middle of the street. He was fast, incredibly fast, closing the distance between them in seconds, while Claire stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities and coming up empty. What did I do? Is this about the hospital? Did Blackwood call someone? Did he report me for assault or theft or some other trumped-up charge that warranted a military response? No. That was insane. The police didn't send Blackhawk helicopters for disgruntled former employees. The soldier reached her, and up close he was even more imposing than he had seemed from a distance. Tall and broad-shouldered, with rain dripping off his tactical helmet and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and then sandblasted into something that no longer registered normal human emotions. He looked at her scrubs, then at her face, then at the deactivated ID badge that was still clipped to her pocket, the one that Karen Walsh hadn't bothered to physically take, only electronically disable. "Claire Sullivan?" He roared over the scream of the rotors, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through butter. Claire nodded, unable to form words, her throat suddenly dry, despite the rain soaking every inch of her body. She gripped her cardboard box tighter, as if the soggy container full of memories could somehow protect her from whatever was about to happen. The soldier tapped his earpiece with one gloved hand. "Asset located. I repeat, asset located. We are at the extraction point." He looked back at Claire, and there was something in his eyes that she hadn't expected to see, something that looked almost like desperation. "Ma'am, you need to come with us. Right now." "I was just fired," Claire stammered, and the absurdity of the sentence hit her even as she said it. The ridiculous disconnect between her mundane professional tragedy and the military helicopters and tactical operators that had apparently descended upon downtown Boston to find her. "I don't work for the hospital anymore. If you need a doctor, Blackwood is the chief of surgery. He's back at St. Matthew's. He can—" "We don't want a doctor," the soldier shouted, and his voice was so sharp, so emphatic that it cut through Claire's confused rambling like a slap across the face. "We don't want Blackwood. Intel says you're the trauma specialist, pediatric thoracic emergencies. 3 different surgeons at 3 different hospitals named you as the best in New England." Claire stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Ma'am," the soldier continued, and now his voice dropped slightly, becoming more human, more urgent, more terrified. "The president's goddaughter is dying. She's at a secure location 20 miles from here and her airway is crushed. The Secret Service medical team can't stabilize her. They tried intubation, they tried everything, but they can't get a tube in, and her oxygen levels are dropping by the minute. We have maybe 4 minutes to get you in the air before she suffocates." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The president's goddaughter. Dying. 4 minutes. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The soldier pressed his eyes, boring into hers. "A child is going to die if you don't come with me right now." Everything that happened next occurred in a blur of motion and noise and adrenaline, the kind of controlled chaos that Claire hadn't experienced since her days in the desert when life and death decisions had to be made in fractions of seconds, and hesitation was a luxury that nobody could afford. She hesitated anyway just for a moment, her mind still struggling to reconcile the impossible situation she found herself in. 5 minutes ago, she'd been a fired nurse walking home in the rain, contemplating the wreckage of her career and wondering how she was going to pay next month's rent. Now she was being told that the President of the United States needed her to save a child's life. "But I can't," she started to say, and she wasn't even sure what she was trying to articulate. "I can't do this. I'm not qualified. I'm not a surgeon. I'm just a nurse. I'm just a woman with a cardboard box full of memories and a career that ended 20 minutes ago." "Drop the box," the soldier commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "We're going." "And now, my husband's picture," Claire heard herself say, and she clutched the soggy cardboard tighter, this ridiculous instinct to protect the last physical reminder of the man she had loved more than her own life. "I can't leave it. I can't." The soldier didn't hesitate. He reached out and grabbed the box from her hands, with one swift motion tucking it under his arm like a football. And before Claire could react, his other arm had swept around her waist and lifted her bodily off the ground. "Then the box comes too," he said. "Go, go, go." He practically threw her into the back of the Blackhawk, and Claire scrambled across the metal floor, her wet scrubs sliding on the diamond plate, her hands grasping for anything to hold on to as the aircraft shuddered around her. The soldier jumped in after her, one hand still clutching her cardboard box, and slammed the door shut with a sound like a thunderclap. "Lift off," he screamed into his headset. "Go punch it." The stomach-churning sensation of zero gravity hit Claire as the helicopter surged upward, banking hard, away from the buildings, and she was thrown against the side of the fuselage before she could brace herself. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw the city of Boston falling away below her, the streets and buildings shrinking into a gray miniature landscape, and there in the distance, she could see St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital, the gray block where her career had ended 10 minutes ago, where Jonathan Blackwood was probably still sitting in his office, celebrating his victory over the nurse who had dared to save a child's life. The soldier strapped her into a jump seat and pressed a headset into her hands. "Put this on." Claire's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely fit the headset over her ears, but once it was in place, the deafening roar of the rotors faded to a manageable hum, and she could hear the soldier's voice with crystal clarity. "My name is Captain Ryan Hayes," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was not accustomed to explaining himself, but was making an exception due to extraordinary circumstances. "I apologize for the extraction method, but we are in a code-critical situation. We were told you were at St. Matthew S. We landed on the roof, but the administrator said you'd been let go." Claire felt a jolt of something, anger or vindication, or some complicated emotion in between. "Let me guess. Dr. Blackwood tried to come instead." Hayes's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the granite facade cracking just enough to show a flicker of contempt. "Yeah, that's the guy. He tried to board the bird. Said he was the superior medical authority, that we were making a mistake by asking for a nurse instead of a surgeon." "What happened?" Hayes cracked a grim smile, and it was the first time Claire had seen anything approaching humanity on his face. "I told him my orders were for Sullivan. He refused to step back. My sniper put a laser dot on his chest and told him to sit down." He paused, and the smile widened slightly. He sat down. Claire stared at the soldier, and despite everything, despite the fear and confusion and the surreal impossibility of this entire situation, she felt a strange hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. She imagined Jonathan Blackwood, the god of St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital, the man who had just destroyed her career because she dared to challenge his authority, cowering on a wet helipad while a military sniper told him he wasn't wanted. It was the first moment of justice she had experienced in what felt like years. And even though it was small, even though it changed nothing about her situation, it felt good. "Where are we going?" she asked, looking out the window at the gray expanse of the Massachusetts coastline rushing by beneath them. "Hanscom Air Force Base," Hayes replied. "Air Force One is on the tarmac, but the medical bay is set up in a hangar. It's a mess down there, Miss Sullivan. We have a structural collapse at a fundraising event." The girl. He trailed off, and Claire saw something in his eyes that she recognized from her own years of dealing with pediatric trauma. That particular horror that came from seeing a child in mortal danger. "It's bad. They have the equipment, but they don't have the hands. The flight surgeon is overwhelmed." Claire looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but it was different now. This wasn't fear or shock or the aftermath of adrenaline. This was something else, something she hadn't felt in years. This was the zone. "Tell me the vitals," she said, and her voice was harder now. More focused, the voice of Staff Sergeant Sullivan rather than Claire, the unemployed nurse. What are her O2 sats? Is she intubated? What interventions have they attempted? Hayes looked at her, and she could see the surprise in his eyes, the reassessment of the soggy, disheveled woman he had just thrown into a helicopter. He tapped his tablet, pulling up information. Oxygen saturation was 82% and dropping as of 3 minutes ago. Trachea is deviated to the left. They tried intubation twice, couldn't get the tube in. Massive swelling, possible complete tracheal transection. They need a surgical airway, Claire said instantly, her mind already racing through the procedure. Cricothyrotomy. But if she's pediatric, the landmarks are going to be almost impossible to find. The anatomy is different in children. Everything is smaller and closer together. One wrong cut and you hit the carotid or the jugular. Exactly, Hayes said. That's why we came for you. Colonel Chen, the flight surgeon? He's good. He's saved men on battlefields with half their faces blown off. But this isn't a soldier with a gunshot wound. This is a little girl with a crushed trachea, and he can't find the landmarks, and he's running out of time. Claire looked out the window again. The coastline was falling behind them now, replaced by the flat expanse of the base, with its hangars and runways, and the distinctive shape of Air Force One sitting on the tarmac like a white whale. "Captain," she said, and her voice was calm, now the calm of someone who had accepted the impossible situation and decided to face it head-on. "I hope you flew fast." Hayes allowed himself another small smile. "Supersonic, ma'am." The Blackhawk didn't so much land as drop out of the sky, the pilot flaring the rotors at the last possible second to cushion an impact that should have rattled Claire's teeth out of her skull. The skids hit the wet tarmac of Hanscom Air Force Base with a jolt that threw her against her harness, and before she could even process the fact that they were on the ground. The side door was sliding open and Captain Hayes was unbuckling her straps. "Move, move, move," he shouted, pulling her toward the door. "We're out of time." Claire's sneakers hit the tarmac and immediately splashed into a puddle of jet fuel and rainwater. Her stomach was still somewhere over the Charles River, left behind during the violent banking maneuver that had taken them out of Boston's airspace, but her mind had snapped into a cold hard focus that she recognized from her years in combat. It was the trauma state, that psychological space where emotions didn't exist, where rent payments and career disasters and arrogant doctors didn't matter. There was only the patient. The problem. The solution. The scene around her was apocalyptic. Aside from the two Blackhawks that had extracted her and were now powering down on the tarmac, there were 3 massive C-130 transport planes, their cargo bays open like hungry mouths disgorging equipment and personnel. Police vehicles and ambulances lined the perimeter, their lights painting the gray afternoon in alternating flashes of red and blue. And looming in the distance, incongruous in its elegant white paint and presidential seal, was Air Force One, looking like a monument to civilization in the middle of a war zone. But they weren't heading for the plane. Hayes grabbed her elbow and started running toward a massive hangar 50 yards away, its doors thrown open to reveal a chaos of bright lights and rushing figures. A perimeter of armored black SUVs formed a steel wall around the entrance, their engines still running, their occupants standing ready with weapons drawn. "Stay close to me," Hayes barked, as they ran, his voice barely audible over the din of aircraft engines and shouting personnel. "Don't stop for anyone. Don't answer any questions. Our only priority is getting you to that patient." They were 20 feet from the hangar entrance when a wall of men in black suits materialized in front of them, appearing out of the chaos like specters of bureaucratic obstruction. Secret Service. Claire realized, recognizing the distinctive earpieces and the barely concealed firearms, and the expressions of men whose sole purpose in life was to prevent unauthorized people from getting close to things they weren't supposed to get close to. One of them stepped forward, a mountain of a man with a buzzed head and a scar running through his left eyebrow, holding up his hand in a gesture that clearly meant, "Stop, or I will make you stop." "Hold it," the agent commanded, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "Who is this?" The manifest lists Dr. Blackwood as the medical specialist. Blackwood is compromised? Hayes shot back without slowing his pace. "This is the primary asset. Nurse Sullivan, pediatric trauma specialist. Stand down, Agent Reynolds, we have a code red in there." Reynolds didn't budge. His eyes swept over Claire, taking in the soaked scrubs, the disheveled blonde hair. the soggy cardboard box that Hayes was still carrying under his arm, and his expression made it clear that he was not impressed by what he saw. "I can't let a civilian without clearance anywhere near the package," he said, and Claire understood that the package was Secret Service terminology for whatever or whoever they were protecting. In this case, apparently a dying child. Something shifted inside Claire. The fear and confusion that had dominated her emotional landscape since the helicopters appeared suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, controlled fury that she hadn't felt since her days in the desert. This man was standing between her and a child who was suffocating to death, and she was done being pushed around by people with authority they hadn't earned and power they didn't deserve. She stepped out from behind Hayes, planting herself directly in front of Agent Reynolds, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She knew what she looked like, a wet, bedraggled woman in ruined scrubs, holding nothing but the tattered remnants of her professional dignity. She didn't care. "Agent Reynolds," she said, and her voice was loud enough to cut through the noise, clear enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. "Captain Hayes told me the patient has a crushed airway with oxygen saturation in the low 80s. That was 5 minutes ago. If she's been trending down, which she almost certainly has been, she's probably in the 60s by now. Do you know what that means?" Reynolds stared at her, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by civilians, let alone civilians who looked like they had just been pulled out of a river. "It means that hypoxic brain injury has already started." Claire continued. "Every second we stand here arguing, brain cells are dying. Every second we waste on protocol and clearances and chain of command, that little girl loses another piece of who she is." She took a step closer, close enough to see the individual pores on the agent's face, close enough to smell the coffee on his breath. "So, you have a choice. You can check my ID. You can call your supervisor. You can follow every procedure in your handbook while a child's brain turns to mush. Or you can step aside and let me do my job, and when the president asks you how his goddaughter survived, you can tell him that you made the right call when it mattered." The silence stretched between them, seconds that felt like hours, while chaos swirled around them and a child gasped for breath somewhere inside that hangar. Then Reynolds stepped aside. "Get her in," he said to Hayes. "Now." The interior of the hangar was a nightmare of organized chaos. A field hospital thrown together in the middle of a concrete cathedral, and Claire absorbed the entire scene in a single sweeping glance as she ran toward the cluster of activity in the center of the vast space. Bright halogen lights on portable stands surrounded a gurney, creating an island of harsh white illumination in the otherwise shadowy hangar. Medical equipment was scattered everywhere. Crash carts and IV stands and monitors, and boxes of supplies that had been torn open in desperate haste. The floor was littered with discarded packaging and bloody gauze, and the general debris of medical intervention gone wrong. 3 people in military medical fatigues surrounded the gurney, moving with the frantic energy of professionals who knew they were losing a battle. One of them, a man with graying hair and sweat pouring down his forehead despite the cool temperature of the hangar, was bent over the patient with the laryngoscope trying to pry open a mouth that had swollen shut. "I can't get the view," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "There's too much blood, I can't see anything. We need more suction. Suction is maxed out." "Colonel," a nurse shouted back, her hands flying across a portable suction unit that was clearly operating at its limit. "Sats are 68 and dropping. She's bradying down, heart rate 42. Claire dropped her focus to the gurney, to the small figure lying motionless under the harsh lights, and something inside her broke. The patient was a little girl, no more than 8 years old, with blonde hair that reminded Claire painfully of photographs of herself at that age. Her face was pale, waxy, the color of a person whose body was slowly shutting down from lack of oxygen. Her lips were a terrifying shade of violet blue, the color of suffocation, the color of death approaching. And her neck was a horror show, swollen and bruised, an angry mass of purple and black that spoke of massive trauma to the delicate structures beneath. This was Sophie, the president's goddaughter, a child who had been healthy and happy and full of life before some terrible accident had crushed her throat and left her gasping for air that couldn't reach her lungs. Claire didn't ask for permission. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't follow any of the protocols or procedures that had been drilled into her during 2 decades of civilian nursing. She simply moved, crossing the distance to the gurney in 3 long strides, and positioning herself at the head of the bed right next to the colonel who was failing to save this child's life. "Stop," she said, and her voice carried an authority that surprised even her, the voice of someone who had made life and death decisions under fire and wasn't about to be intimidated by rank or hierarchy. The Colonel Dr. David Chen, according to the name tape on his fatigues, snapped his head up and stared at her with wild eyes. Who the hell are you? I'm the person who's going to tell you that you're digging around in a shattered larynx. Claire said, her eyes locked on Sophie's ruined neck. She pointed to the puffiness spreading across the child's collarbone, the telltale sign that she'd seen too many times in her career. Look at the subcutaneous emphysema. Air is leaking into the surrounding tissues, which means her trachea isn't just damaged, it's likely transected. Completely. You keep trying to intubate through her mouth, you're going to tear whatever's left of the airway. She'll never breathe again. Chen stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, and Claire could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was a colonel, a flight surgeon, a man who had undoubtedly saved lives in war zones and disaster areas around the world. And here was a woman in wet civilian scrubs telling him he was doing it wrong. "We need a surgical airway," Chen said finally, and his voice was trembling now, the adrenaline and fear finally breaking through his professional facade. "Cricothyrotomy." But the landmarks. He gestured helplessly at Sophie's swollen neck. "I can't find them. The swelling is too severe. If I cut and miss, I could hit the carotid or the jugular," Claire finished for him. "And she bleeds out in 10 seconds. I can't do it," Chen whispered, and the admission seemed to cost him something fundamental, some piece of professional pride that would never fully recover. "I can't see anything. I've done this procedure 100 times on adults, but on a child with this much trauma." He shook his head. "I can't find the landmarks. I don't know where to cut." Claire looked at the monitor. Heart rate 45. Oxygen saturation 60%. The flatline tone was seconds away. For a moment, just a moment, Claire wasn't in a hangar in Massachusetts. She was back in the desert, back in the dust and blood and chaos of a war zone, kneeling beside another child with another crushed airway. The memory hit her with physical force. A compound in Fallujah, 2006. An American contractor's daughter caught in the crossfire of a raid gone wrong. 8 years old, blonde hair like Sophie's throat, crushed by falling debris. Claire had saved her with nothing but a field knife and a ballpoint pen cutting into the child's neck, while gunfire echoed off the walls around them. That girl had lived. She was 23 now, somewhere in America, living a life that Claire had made possible with her training and her courage, and her absolute refusal to let a child die while she had breath in her body. She could do this. She had done this. Claire stripped off her wet jacket, revealing the blue scrubs beneath, and snapped on a pair of sterile gloves from the open box on the instrument tray. The familiar stretch of latex against her fingers centered her, grounded her, in the present moment. "Give me the scalpel," she said, extending her hand toward Colonel Chen. Chen stared at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "You're a nurse." "I'm a trauma nurse who spent 10 years in the busiest emergency room in Boston," Claire replied, her voice steady as stone. "Before that, I was a combat medic with the 3rd Infantry Division. I did 3 of these in the back of a burning Humvee, while mortars fell around me." She met his eyes, letting him see the soldier beneath the civilian exterior. "Give me the scalpel, Colonel. Unless you want to explain to the president why his goddaughter died while we stood here arguing about credentials." Chen looked at the monitor, flatline tone approaching that terrible steady whine that meant time had run out. He slapped the scalpel into her hand. The hangar went absolutely silent. Even the Secret Service agents at the perimeter seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something momentous was happening that the next few seconds would determine whether a child lived or died. Claire closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and visualized the anatomy beneath the swelling. The thyroid cartilage, the cricoid ring, the tiny membrane between them no bigger than a postage stamp, the one location where she could cut without hitting a major blood vessel. It was there. It had to be there. She opened her eyes. "I need everyone to be absolutely quiet," she said softly. "I need to feel this." She reached out with her left hand, her fingers probing the ruined landscape of Sophie's neck. It felt like pressing on a water balloon, the tissues so swollen with fluid and trapped air that the normal landmarks had been completely obliterated. She could feel the military nurse beside her tensing, could hear the soft beeping of the monitor slowing down the rhythm of a heart that was giving up. Beep, beep, beep. Claire pressed harder, ignoring the fluid shifting under the skin, searching for any hint of structure beneath the chaos. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically reading the child's anatomy, like a blind person reading Braille. And then she felt it. A tiny ridge, a hard spot amidst the soft horror of traumatized tissue, the cricoid cartilage. "I have it," she said softly. She didn't hesitate. With her right hand, she brought the scalpel down, making a horizontal incision with the confidence of someone who had done this in far worse conditions than a well-lit hangar with the full surgical team standing by. Blood welled up immediately, dark and fast, and Claire heard someone behind her gasp. "Suction," she commanded, and her voice was calm, controlled the voice of a surgeon who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The military nurse moved instantly, clearing the field with the suction tip. Claire used the back of the scalpel handle to separate the tissue, peeling back layers of blood and muscle, searching for the white flash of cartilage that would tell her she was in the right place. "There. 4.0 tube," she said. "Now." Chen handed her the pediatric tracheostomy tube, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm going in," Claire announced. She pushed the tube into the incision, feeling it meet resistance almost immediately. The cartilage was crushed, distorted a maze of damaged tissue that wanted to trap the tube and prevent it from reaching the airway. If she pushed too hard, she would collapse what was left of the structure. If she didn't push hard enough, the tube would end up in a false passage and air would fill the neck instead of the lungs. Claire twisted her wrist, a corkscrew motion that she had learned from an old Vietnam veteran medic during her first deployment. The movement was gentle but firm, threading the needle between too much and not enough. The tube popped through the resistance. "Bag her," Claire said. The nurse attached the ambu bag and squeezed, forcing air through the tube. Everyone in the hangar stared at Sophie's chest, waiting for the rise that would mean success. Nothing happened. "No breath sounds," Chen shouted, his stethoscope pressed against Sophie's chest. "You missed. The tube isn't in the airway." "I didn't miss," Claire gritted out, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "It's a mucus plug. The trauma caused a blockage." She grabbed a suction catheter, threaded it down through the new tube, and applied negative pressure. When she pulled it back, a thick clot of blood and mucus came with it. A solid plug of debris that had been blocking the airway like a cork in a bottle. "Bag her again," Claire commanded. The nurse squeezed the bag, and this time Sophie's chest rose. A beautiful, symmetrical rise, both lungs inflating together. "We have breath sounds," Chen shouted, relief cracking his voice. "Bilateral good air entry on both sides." Claire allowed herself one breath, one moment of relief, and then the monitor flatlined. The continuous damning tone of the flatline filled the hangar like a death knell, drowning out every other sound, every other thought, every other reality, except the terrible fact that Sophie's heart had stopped beating. "She's in arrest." Colonel Chen shouted, his hands already moving toward the child's chest. "Starting CPR." But Claire grabbed his arm before he could begin compressions, her fingers digging into his flesh with a grip that surprised both of them. "No," she said. "Wait. Wait." Chen stared at her like she had lost her mind. "Her heart has stopped. We need to. I know what we need." Claire cut him off, her mind racing through the diagnostic possibilities with the speed of someone who had seen this exact situation before in a dusty compound in Fallujah, with another child whose heart had stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with the heart itself. "The tube is in the right place. I felt it enter the trachea. Breath sounds were bilateral. This isn't a failed intubation." She looked at Sophie's chest, at the way the left side seemed slightly more distended than the right, at the subtle asymmetry that most people would have missed, but that Claire's trained eyes caught immediately. "It's a tension pneumothorax," she said, and suddenly everything made sense, the pieces clicking together into a picture that was terrifying but treatable. Air is filling her chest cavity. Not from the tube, from the original trauma. There must be a tear in the lung tissue that we didn't see. The air is building up outside her lungs, compressing them, crushing her heart from the outside. Chen's face went pale as he understood the implications. "If we do CPR on a tension pneumo, we make it worse," Claire finished. "Every compression pushes more air into the cavity. Her heart doesn't need to be restarted. It needs room to beat." She looked around frantically, spotting what she needed on the instrument tray. "I need a 14-gauge needle. Right now." The military nurse hesitated for just a fraction of a second, looking at Chen for confirmation. "Give it to her," Chen shouted, and whatever reservations he had about taking orders from a civilian nurse in wet scrubs had been burned away by the reality of a child dying in front of him. The needle was in Claire's hand before the nurse had fully extended her arm. Claire found the second intercostal space on Sophie's chest, the spot between the second and third ribs, directly in line with the middle of the collarbone. This was a procedure she had performed 47 times in combat zones, often in the dark, often under fire, often on patients who were already technically dead by any conventional measurement. She pushed the needle through the chest wall. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and violent, a rush of trapped gas that sounded like a tire being punctured, and Claire watched as the distended left side of Sophie's chest visibly deflated the pressure, releasing the compression on her heart easing. Everyone stared at the monitor. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, nothing. And then beep. A single heartbeat, tentative and weak. Beep, beep. Stronger now, finding its rhythm. Beep, 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 beep. The oxygen saturation numbers began to climb. 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 98. Sophie's lips, which had been the color of a bruise just moments ago, began to fade from violet to pink, the terrible blue tinge retreating as oxygen finally reached the tissues that had been starving for it. "She's back," Chen whispered, and his voice was thick with emotion, cracking on the words. "Oh my God, she's back." Claire secured the needle with tape, ensuring that the decompression would continue to function, then stepped back from the table and began peeling off her bloody gloves. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline that had carried her through the procedure finally releasing its grip on her nervous system. She had done it. Against all odds, with improvised equipment and no surgical team, and a child who had been minutes from death, she had done it. Sophie was alive. The aftermath of a successful resuscitation is a strange thing. A liminal space between crisis and calm, where the body hasn't yet caught up with the reality that the danger has passed. Claire leaned against a metal supply cart, her legs suddenly feeling like they were made of water instead of muscle and bone, and she wiped the sweat and rain from her forehead with her forearm. Colonel Chen was still standing at the gurney, staring at Sophie's chest as it rose and fell with the easy rhythm of normal breathing, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He started, then stopped, shook his head, started again. "I've been a flight surgeon for 18 years. I've operated in 3 different war zones. I've saved men who had half their faces blown off by IEDs. Men who should have died 10 times over before they reached my operating table." He looked at Claire with an expression that mixed awe with something that might have been shame. That was the finest piece of emergency medicine I have ever witnessed. Both procedures, the crick and the decompression, executed perfectly under impossible conditions. And I say that as someone who couldn't do it myself. Claire managed a weak smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "Just plumbing, Colonel. That's all medicine really is when you strip away the fancy degrees and the expensive equipment. Just plumbing. Finding the blockage, clearing the line, making sure the fluid goes where it's supposed to go." She looked around for her cardboard box, suddenly desperate for the comfort of something familiar, something that connected her to who she was outside of this hangar. She spotted it on a supply crate, where Hayes had set it down, the cardboard even more waterlogged than before, barely holding together. The truth hit her then, settling into her chest like a stone. She had saved this girl, but nothing else had changed. She was still unemployed. She was still the woman who had been walked out of St. Matthew's by security, while her colleagues refused to meet her eyes. She was still going to have to figure out how to pay her rent and fix her car and rebuild a career that had been destroyed by a man who valued his ego more than a child's life. The hollow feeling surprised her. She had expected triumph, vindication, something approaching happiness. Instead, she felt empty, exhausted, wrung out like a dish rag that had been used too many times. She had no one to call, no one to share this moment with. Michael had been dead for 14 years, and she had never really let anyone else get close enough to fill the void he had left behind. But then the activity at the hangar entrance suddenly spiked, and Claire looked up to see the Secret Service agents straightening to attention, their hands clasping in front of them in that distinctive pose that meant someone important was approaching. The wall of suits parted like the Red Sea, and President Daniel Mitchell walked into the hangar. He didn't look like a president. That was Claire's first thought as she watched him cross the concrete floor of the hangar with long, urgent strides. He was wearing a casual windbreaker and jeans, no suit, no tie, none of the formal trappings of the most powerful office in the world. He looked like a man, just a man who was terrified for someone he loved. He was flanked by 4 Secret Service agents who looked even more dangerous than the ones Claire had encountered outside their eyes, constantly scanning their hands, never far from their weapons. But Mitchell seemed oblivious to his protection detail. his entire focus locked on the gurney where Sophie lay, finally breathing, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a child who was going to live. "Sophie," he said, and his voice cracked on the name as he reached the bedside and took her small hand in his much larger one. "Oh, sweetheart." Colonel Chen stepped forward, his posture straightening instinctively in the presence of his commander-in-chief. "She's stable, Mr. President. Her airway is secure. Oxygen saturation is at 100%. Mitchell closed his eyes and exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release years of tension from his body. When he opened his eyes again, they were glistening with unshed tears. "They told me she was choking," he said quietly. "They told me you couldn't get a tube in, that she was suffocating, that there was nothing anyone could do. I couldn't," Sor Chen admitted, and Claire could see how much the confession cost him, how much it hurt his professional pride to admit failure in front of the President of the United States. It was a complex injury. The swelling obscured all the landmarks. "I couldn't find a safe place to cut. I was afraid that if I tried, I would kill her." Mitchell looked at Chen for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then Hooted Chen stepped aside and extended his hand toward the woman leaning against the supply cart, still wearing her rain-soaked scrubs, her blonde hair a disaster clutching a soggy cardboard box that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. "She did," Sir Chen said. "Nurse Sullivan." The President of the United States walked toward Claire, and with each step, the distance between them seemed to shrink in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. He stopped in front of her, and up close she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the evidence of the enormous pressure that came with his position. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just an uncle who had almost lost his niece. He extended his hand, and when Claire took it, his grip was warm and firm and genuine. "You saved her life," he said simply. "My sister Sophie's mother passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. I promised her that I would look after Sophie, that I would protect her, that nothing would ever happen to her." His voice caught, and he had to pause for a moment to compose himself. "If we had lost her today, if she had died while I was sitting in meetings talking about budgets and policies and all the things that suddenly seemed so completely meaningless." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You have the gratitude of a nation," President Mitchell said, "and the eternal debt of a godfather." Claire nodded, not trusting her voice to speak, overwhelmed by the surreal reality of the moment. 30 minutes ago, she had been walking in the rain with the cardboard box, convinced that her life was over. Now, she was standing in a hangar, holding hands with the President of the United States, being thanked for saving a child's life. "Where are you based?" Mitchell asked, and his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike, more presidential. "St. Matthew's, right. That's where Captain Hayes picked you up. I want to call your administrator personally. I want to tell them that they have a national treasure on their staff, someone who should be recognized and rewarded for the kind of excellence that you demonstrated today." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She could lie. The thought flashed through her mind with the seductive whisper of self-preservation. She could say, "Yes, let him make the call," and maybe Blackwood would be so intimidated by presidential attention that he would hire her back, sweep the whole ugly incident under the rug, pretend it never happened. But then she looked at the cardboard box under her arm, at the corner of Michael's photograph visible through the disintegrating cardboard, and she thought about the kind of man her husband had been. Michael had been a lot of things: wide, stubborn, reckless, infuriatingly optimistic. But one thing he had never been was a liar. He had believed that the truth was always better than a comfortable deception, even when the truth was painful, even when it cost you something you didn't want to lose. Claire couldn't dishonor his memory by starting now. "I'm not at St. Matthew's anymore." "Mr. President," she said quietly. Mitchell's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Did you transfer? Are you at a different hospital now?" Claire lifted the soggy box slightly, drawing his attention to it. "No, sir. About 20 minutes before your helicopter landed, I was fired." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the hangar seemed to freeze, from the Secret Service agents to the medical personnel to Captain Hayes, who was standing nearby with an expression of dawning understanding. "Fired," Mitchell repeated as if he hadn't heard correctly, as if the word didn't compute in the context of the woman who had just performed a medical miracle. "Yes, sir." For insubordination. Claire took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. "I administered epinephrine to a dying 8-year-old boy while the chief of surgery was on the phone debating insurance authorization with the legal department. The boy was in anaphylaxis. His throat was closing. He was turning blue. And Dr. Blackwood was worried about liability. She met the president's eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to be ashamed of what she had done. I saved the boy. His name is Leo, and he's alive right now because I broke protocol. But I embarrassed Dr. Blackwood in front of his staff, and he doesn't tolerate being embarrassed. So he had me terminated. Effective immediately. No severance, no appeal, no chance to defend myself. President Mitchell's expression had changed during her confession, shifting from confusion to understanding to something much darker, much more dangerous. It was the expression of a man who had commanded military forces, who had made decisions that affected millions of lives, who did not tolerate petty tyrants abusing their power. You were fired, he said slowly, each word precise and cold, for saving a child's life. Yes, sir. By Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. Mitchell turned to his chief of staff, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena, who had been standing silently in the background, tablet in hand. Get the Secretary of Health and Human Services on the phone. Mitchell said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than if he had been shouting. And the governor of Massachusetts. And find out who sits on the board of directors for St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital. He turned back to Claire, and there was a small, grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Nurse Sullivan, the president, said, I don't think you're going to be unemployed for very long. 1 hour later, Claire found herself sitting in a place she had never imagined she would ever see in person, the executive conference room of Air Force One. The contrast with her situation 60 minutes earlier was so extreme that it felt like a hallucination, like a fever dream, brought on by hypothermia and emotional exhaustion. She was wearing a dry navy blue Secret Service windbreaker that someone had found for her, and she was sipping hot tea from a cup that bore the presidential seal. Through the window, she could see the tarmac of Hanscom Air Force Base, where helicopters and SUVs moved in organized patterns that spoke of immense power mobilizing for purposes she could only guess at. Sophie had been airlifted to Walter Reed Medical Center by a specialized transport team. The last Claire had heard, the little girl was stable, sedated, and expected to make a full recovery. Doctors were already talking about reconstructive surgery to repair the damage to her trachea, about the long road of physical therapy that lay ahead, but the important thing, the only thing that really mattered, was that she was going to live. President Mitchell sat across from Claire, reviewing a file that his aides had compiled during the flight from Boston. His casual demeanor from the hangar had been replaced by something harder, more focused, the demeanor of a man who was preparing for battle. 20 years, he said, looking up from the folder. Perfect attendance. 3 commendations for valor during the pandemic, when you volunteered for extra shifts in the COVID ward. Even though you could have stayed in the relative safety of the trauma unit. Not a single disciplinary mark on your record until today. He closed the folder. And before nursing, you were a combat medic. 3rd Infantry Division, 2 tours in Iraq. Bronze Star for valor. That was a different life, Sir Claire said quietly. Clearly not, Mitchell replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested admiration, recognition of a kindred spirit. That soldier saved my goddaughter today. That soldier is still very much alive. Before Claire could respond, Elena entered the room, her face tight with controlled urgency. Mr. President, you need to see this, she said, turning on the large monitor mounted on the wall. It's trending worldwide. The hashtag Where's the Nurse is the #1 topic on every social media platform. The screen filled with shaky cell phone footage, clearly shot by a pedestrian on a Boston street. Claire watched herself from an outside perspective for the first time, seeing the Blackhawk landing in the intersection, seeing Captain Hayes sprint toward a bedraggled woman in blue scrubs, hearing his voice cut through the chaos of the rotor noise. We don't want the doctor. We want the nurse. Then the footage showed Hayes practically throwing her into the helicopter, the aircraft lifting off and banking away over the city skyline, leaving behind a crowd of stunned onlookers and a traffic jam that would probably take hours to clear. The internet is losing its mind. Elena continued scrolling through what appeared to be an endless stream of social media posts. Everyone wants to know who the nurse is, why the military wanted her specifically, and why she was standing on a street corner with a box of personal belongings in the middle of a workday. Claire felt her face flush with embarrassment. They had seen the box. They had seen her walking in the rain looking like a refugee from her own life. They've already identified you, Elena said. Internet detectives matched your image to the St. Matthew's staff page. But here's the problem. She clicked a remote and the screen switched to a live news feed. CNN, A red banner across the bottom read, St. Matthew's Hospital addresses viral military incident. And there, standing at a podium in the hospital lobby, was Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. He looked grave serious, every inch the concerned administrator, dealing with a difficult situation. Behind him stood Karen Walsh, nodding along with everything he said. We are aware of the dramatic footage involving one of our former employees, Miss Claire Sullivan. Blackwood said, his voice smooth and practiced. It is a regrettable situation. Miss Sullivan was terminated earlier today for concerning behavior. While I cannot go into specifics due to privacy laws, I can say that her actions endangered patient safety. She was in a state of mental instability. Claire shot to her feet so fast that her chair tipped over behind her. That liar! She shouted, months of suppressed anger finally boiling over. Unstable. I saved a boy's life. I saved your goddaughter's life. On the screen, Blackwood continued, oblivious to the fury he was provoking thousands of miles away. We believe the military may have been acting on outdated information when they extracted her. We are cooperating fully with authorities to ensure that Miss Sullivan receives the help she needs. Claire felt tears pricking at her eyes. Tears of rage and frustration, and the dawning horror that Blackwood was going to win. He was going to destroy her reputation on national television. He was going to paint her as a mentally unstable liability who had been rightfully terminated, and everyone would believe him because he was a doctor, and she was just a nurse because he had power and connections, and she had nothing but a soggy cardboard box. And the truth. He's getting ahead of the narrative, Mitchell said, and his voice was calm, analytical, the voice of a strategist assessing an opponent's moves. He knows the military picked you up. He knows that if the real story comes out, he looks like the villain who fired a hero. So he's trying to discredit you before you can tell your side. He's going to win. Claire whispered, the fight draining out of her. He has lawyers. He has the hospital board. He has connections I can't even imagine. And I'm nobody. I'm just a fired nurse with no job and no money and no way to fight back. President Mitchell stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the organized chaos of the tarmac below. You're not nobody, Claire, he said quietly. You're the woman who saved Sophie. And I take it very personally when people lie about my friends. Mitchell turned back to face her, and there was something different in his eyes now. Something personal that went beyond presidential concern for a citizen who had been wronged. Besides, he continued, I know Jonathan Blackwood. We have history. Claire's blood ran cold. Sir, your husband was Michael Sullivan, Mitchell said, and it wasn't a question. 3rd Infantry Division combat medic, served 2 tours in Iraq. Died in 2010 at a VA hospital from complications following what should have been a routine surgery. Claire couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except stare at the President of the United States as he calmly recited the details of the worst day of her life. The surgeon who operated on Michael was a young resident named Dr. Harrison Wells. Mitchell continued, talented but inexperienced, and supervised by a mentor who had a reputation for cutting corners when it came to veteran care. That mentor was Jonathan Blackwood. The room seemed to tilt. Claire grabbed the edge of the conference table to steady herself. I was on the Congressional Oversight Committee that reviewed military hospital complaints in 2010, Mitchell said. We received multiple reports about suspicious outcomes at the VA hospital where Michael died. Unexplained complications. Patients who went into surgery healthy and came out dead. We suspected malpractice, possibly worse, but every time we tried to investigate, we hit walls. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Someone with power and connections was protecting the doctors involved. Blackwood, Claire whispered. Mitchell nodded slowly. I've been waiting 14 years for that man to make a mistake I could prove. Something public. Something undeniable. He met her eyes, and there was something fierce in his gaze. Something that spoke of long-simmered anger finally finding an outlet. Today he fired a woman for saving a child's life. He lied about her on national television. And he tried to insert himself into a federal emergency so he could take credit for a rescue he had nothing to do with. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. You just handed me everything I need, Claire, and I intend to use it. Mitchell buttoned his jacket with the decisive movements of a man preparing for combat. Dr. Blackwood is holding a press conference right now, Elena reported. He's taking questions for another 20 minutes. Good, Mitchell said. Claire, grab your things. We're going to Boston. Sir, I have a meeting with the governor this afternoon anyway. I think we can make a small detour. His smile widened, taking on an edge that made Claire think of sharks circling wounded prey. I think it's time we returned you to your workplace. And I think we should do it while the cameras are still rolling. The press room at St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital had never been so crowded. Every news outlet in Boston was there, plus the national bureaus that had scrambled crews to cover the viral Blackhawk nurse story. Cameras and microphones bristled from every corner aimed at the podium, where Dr. Jonathan Blackwood was holding court like a king addressing his subjects. He was enjoying himself. Claire could see it in the way he stood, the way he gestured, the subtle smirk that played at the corners of his mouth, even as he spoke words of concern and regret. He had always loved attention, always craved the spotlight, and now he had the biggest audience of his career hanging on his every word. It is never easy to let a staff member go. Blackwood was saying, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. Claire Sullivan was a fixture at St. Matthew's for a very long time, but medicine requires precision, not vigilantism. We have strict protocols for a reason, and when those protocols are violated, patients suffer. But why did the military want her, specifically a reporter from the Boston Globe, pressed? They flew 2 Blackhawk helicopters into downtown Boston and extracted her like she was a VIP. That doesn't happen by accident. Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. A clerical error, I'm sure. I offered my own services to the rescue team, but in the confusion they grabbed the first person they saw wearing scrubs. It was a chaotic scene. He was about to continue when every phone in the room lit up simultaneously. Buzzes, chimes, and notification sounds created a symphony of digital interruption that made Blackwood pause mid-sentence. What is it, he asked, clearly annoyed by the distraction. A reporter in the front row looked up from his phone with wide eyes. Dr. Blackwood, are you aware that the presidential motorcade just exited the highway? Traffic control says they're heading directly for St. Matthew's. Blackwood's face went pale. Here, why would they be coming here? Before anyone could answer, the wail of sirens began to bleed into the room from the street outside. Not one siren. Not two. A symphony of them, the coordinated scream of a full presidential motorcade in motion. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, red and blue lights began to flash. The rumble of armored vehicles vibrated through the floor. Then the doors burst open, and 2 Secret Service agents in full tactical gear swept into the lobby, their rifles held at the ready. "Clear the lane," one of them shouted. "Make a hole." The reporters parted instantly, abandoning their positions around the podium to create a clear path from the entrance to where Blackwood stood. They turned their cameras, their microphones, their attention away from the chief of surgery and toward the doors. Chicago police officers entered first, followed by Secret Service agents, followed by more police. The amount of security was overwhelming, designed to impress, to intimidate, to make it absolutely clear that the power entering this building was not to be trifled with. And then, walking side by side through the gauntlet of armed personnel, came President Daniel Mitchell and Claire Sullivan. Claire was still wearing the oversized Secret Service windbreaker, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that she hadn't had time to fix. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been through hell in the past 2 hours and had come out the other side with a story to tell. But she walked with her head high, and the President of the United States had his hand on her back, guiding her, supporting her, presenting her to the assembled press corps as if she were a visiting head of state. The room exploded with flashbulbs. Blackwood gripped the podium so hard that Claire could see his knuckles turning white from across the room. His face had gone from pale to ashen, the color of a man watching his own professional obituary being written in real time. President Mitchell didn't stop at the edge of the crowd. He walked directly to the podium, directly to where Blackwood was standing, frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. "Excuse me," Dr. Mitchell said, and his voice was amplified by the microphone that Blackwood was still standing in front of. "I believe you're in my spot." Blackwood stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a cable in his haste to get away from the podium. "Mr. President, we weren't expecting." Mitchell ignored him completely. He adjusted the microphone to his height, took a moment to look directly into the bank of cameras, and began to speak. "My fellow Americans," he said, and his voice carried the weight of the office he held, the authority of a man who had been elected to lead the most powerful nation on earth. "I apologize for interrupting Dr. Blackwood's press conference, but I was watching it from Air Force One and I felt compelled to come down here and correct the record." He gestured to Claire, who had positioned herself to his right, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm despite the terror she felt inside. "Dr. Blackwood just told you that Claire Sullivan was fired for mental instability. He told you that she was a liability to this hospital, that she endangered patients, that the military made a mistake in extracting her. Mitchell let the silence hang for a moment, heavy and expectant. The truth, he continued, is very different. 2 hours ago, my goddaughter Sophie suffered a catastrophic airway collapse at a fundraising event. She couldn't breathe. Her throat was crushed, and she was dying. The room was absolutely silent now, every reporter hanging on every word. The best doctors in the military tried to save her. They couldn't. The Secret Service medical team tried to save her. They couldn't. We asked for Claire Sullivan by name because 3 different surgeons at 3 different hospitals identified her as the best thoracic trauma specialist in New England. Mitchell's voice hardened. When she arrived, she didn't just assist. She performed 2 separate life-saving procedures that the military flight surgeon was afraid to attempt. She cut into my goddaughter's throat to create an airway when no one else could find the landmarks. And when Sophie's heart stopped from a complication no one had anticipated. Claire diagnosed it in seconds and performed a second emergency procedure that saved her life. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled reporters. She saved my family, Mitchell said simply. And she did it exactly 1 hour after being fired by this man. He pointed directly at Blackwood, who was now visibly sweating, his perfect composure crumbling like a sandcastle in a rising tide. And why was she fired? Because earlier today, she saved another child's life. An 8-year-old boy named Leo, who was dying of anaphylaxis, while Dr. Blackwood debated insurance authorization with the legal department. The reporters turned on Blackwood like a pack of wolves who had finally spotted wounded prey. Dr. Blackwood, is that true? Did you fire her for saving a patient? Did you lie about her mental state? Blackwood held up his hands, his voice cracking. Now wait. Wait a minute. There are complexities. Insurance protocols. Chain of command. Insurance protocols, Claire said. And it was the first time she had spoken since entering the room. Every camera swung toward her. Leo was dying, Jonathan. Her voice was steady now, fueled by months of suppressed anger and years of suspicion, finally finding an outlet. He was 8 years old. His face was turning blue and his mother was screaming, and you were on the phone with lawyers. I didn't have time for your protocols. I didn't have time for your chain of command. I had time to save a child's life, so that's what I did. Blackwood tried to rally to summon the arrogance that had carried him through 3 decades of hospital politics. This is absurd. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital. I determine the fitness of my medical staff. You cannot simply waltz in here and... Actually, President Mitchell interrupted, his voice cutting through Blackwood's bluster like a knife through butter. I can do quite a bit more than that. He nodded to Agent Reynolds, who stepped forward holding a manila envelope. Mitchell accepted it, opened it slowly, deliberately letting the tension build. While I was flying here, Dr. Blackwood, I had the Department of Justice conduct an emergency review of the billing practices at St. Matthew's Memorial Hospital under your administration. It seems that prioritizing profit over patients is something of a habit for you. Blackwood's face went gray. We found discrepancies, Mitchell continued, significant ones, overbilling, unnecessary procedures, a pattern of behavior that the FBI will be very interested in examining more closely. He let that sink in for a moment, then added, I also made a call to the chairman of this hospital's board of directors. He was very interested to hear that his chief of surgery had just gone on national television and lied about a nurse, lied about the military, and lied about the President of the United States. Mitchell glanced at Karen Walsh, who was standing frozen at the edge of the stage, looking like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. Karen Mitchell said pleasantly, I believe the chairman is on the phone with you right now. Isn't he? Karen's face went through a rapid series of expressions, calculating, desperate, and finally resigned. She had clearly realized which way the wind was blowing, and she had no intention of going down with Blackwood's ship. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, one that she had obviously prepared the moment the motorcade arrived, and turned to face Blackwood with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. Dr. Blackwood Karen, said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Effective immediately, the board of directors has voted to suspend your hospital privileges, pending a full investigation into your conduct. You are to be escorted from the premises immediately. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, Blackwood sputtering protests that no one was listening to. You can't do this, he shouted, his carefully cultivated composure finally shattering completely. I built this wing. I am this hospital. I have connections that... Mr. Patterson, Claire said quietly, From the back of the room, a familiar figure stepped forward. Old Pat, the security guard who had escorted Claire out of this same building just hours earlier, was grinning from ear to ear. In his hands, he held a cardboard box, an empty one. "I believe you know the way out," Dr. Mr. Patterson said, and there was 2 decades worth of satisfaction in his voice. "And here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I'm sure you'll manage." The flashbulbs blinded Blackwood as he took the box with trembling hands, his arrogance finally completely utterly crushed under the weight of his own hubris. The October sun was warm on Claire's face as she stood beneath the white tent in the courtyard, a perfect contrast to the cold rain that had been falling exactly 1 year ago, when her world had fallen apart and been rebuilt in the span of a single afternoon. She smoothed the lapel of her white coat, a gesture that had become habitual over the past 12 months, and allowed herself a moment to appreciate how much had changed. This wasn't the standard nurse's uniform she had worn for 2 decades. This was the coat of the Director of Nursing Operations at the newly renamed Sullivan Center for Pediatric Trauma. Beneath her name, embroidered in elegant gold thread, were the words, "Patient Advocate, Chief." And beneath the coat, she wore a fitted red dress that made her feel for the first time in years like a woman who had earned the right to be seen. The courtyard was filled with people, hundreds of them spilling out of the tent and onto the manicured lawns. Doctors and nurses who had once been too afraid to meet her eyes now stood tall, proud to work in a hospital where speaking up for patients was celebrated rather than punished. Former patients whose lives had been saved by the protocols Claire had implemented. Military personnel who had served with her in Iraq and had flown in from across the country to witness this moment. And in the front row, beaming like a proud father, sat President Daniel Mitchell with Sophie beside him. The little girl was 9 now, healthy and vibrant, with only a thin scar on her neck to mark the day she had almost died. She was currently trying to sneak a cookie from the buffet table when she thought no one was looking. "You look nervous," a voice said beside Claire. She turned to find Leo standing there, the boy whose life she had saved with a dose of epinephrine and a willingness to break the rules. He was 9 years old now, dressed in his Sunday best, looking up at her with the easy confidence of a child who had never learned to be afraid of authority. "Speeches aren't really my thing," Claire admitted, crouching down to his level. "I prefer IVs and emergency procedures." "Just tell them the helicopter story again," Leo said, his eyes bright with excitement. "That's the best part. Everyone loves the helicopter story." Claire laughed, a genuine sound that felt foreign after so many years of holding herself together. "I think everyone knows that story by now, Leo." "Then tell it anyway," he said with the unassailable logic of childhood. "Good stories get better every time you tell them." The applause that greeted Claire as she approached the podium wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was a roar, a wave of sound that washed over her and threatened to knock her off her feet. She gripped the edges of the podium, waiting for the noise to subside, and looked out at the sea of faces before her. She saw Mr. Patterson near the back, still the head of security, but now sporting a much nicer uniform and a raise that she had personally insisted upon. She saw the nurses who had once been too afraid to defend her, now empowered, confident, knowing that they would never again be punished for putting patients first. A year ago, Claire began, her voice steady and clear. "I walked out of these doors with the cardboard box. I thought my value was determined by an ID badge and a payroll number. I thought power belonged to people with the biggest titles and the most impressive degrees." She paused, her eyes finding Leo and Sophie in the crowd. "But I learned something that day. Power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help someone who needs you. Authority isn't given by a board of directors. It's earned through the trust of the people whose lives you hold in your hands." Her voice grew stronger, carrying across the silent courtyard. "When we put on these scrubs, we aren't just employees. We are the last line of defense between life and death. And no policy, no protocol, and no administrator should ever stand between us and doing what is right." She gripped the podium harder, channeling 20 years of frustration and a lifetime of fighting into her words. "This center isn't named after me because I'm special. It's named after a nurse to send a message in this building. The patient comes first. Always. And if you ever have to break a rule to save a life," she allowed herself a small smile, "I suggest you do it. Just make sure you have a good lawyer, or at least a president on speed dial." The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, and Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, and the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the courtyard, President Mitchell approached Claire with a small velvet box in his hand. Captain Hayes couldn't be here, Mitchell said. He's deployed overseas on an operation I can't tell you about, but he asked me to give you this. Claire accepted the box and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a military morale patch. It showed the silhouette of a Blackhawk helicopter against a medical cross, and beneath it in bold letters were the words, "We don't want the doctor." Tears welled in her eyes as she closed the box and held it against her chest. "Thank you, Mr. President," she whispered. "No," Mitchell said, squeezing her shoulder. "Thank you, Claire, for Sophie, for Leo, for everyone you're going to save in the years to come." He walked away with his Secret Service detail, leaving Claire alone in the fading afternoon light. She made her way to a quiet corner of the courtyard, away from the lingering guests and the cleanup crews, and pulled out the photograph she always carried with her now, no longer in a soggy cardboard box, but in an elegant silver frame that fit perfectly in her coat pocket. Michael smiled up at her, frozen forever, at 32, full of the life and warmth that she had loved so desperately and lost so completely. "I did it, Mike," she said softly, her voice breaking on his name. "I finally stopped running from who I am. You always said I was too stubborn to follow orders. Turns out that's not a weakness. It's what makes me who I am." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip, remembering the way he used to hold her, the way he used to believe in her. Even when she didn't believe in herself. I wish you could have seen it. The helicopters, the president, Blackwood's face when they handed him that box. She laughed through her tears. "You would have loved it." A breeze rustled through the courtyard, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and new beginnings. "I'll keep saving them," Mike Claire whispered. "Every single one I can. That's my promise to you." She tucked the photograph back into her pocket over her heart and walked toward the hospital entrance. She stopped at the spot on the sidewalk where the helicopter had landed 1 year ago, where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The scorch marks from the Blackhawk's tires were long faded, but she could still feel the wind on her face. Still hear the thunder of the rotors, still see Captain Hayes sprinting toward her through the rain. She looked at her reflection in the glass doors. The blonde hair now streaked with gray, the lines around her eyes that spoke of years of fighting and loss and triumph. But she also saw a woman who had walked through fire and emerged holding water. A woman who had refused to let the bastards grind her down. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a guardian, a fighter, a survivor. And she had patience waiting. Claire Sullivan pushed open the doors and walked back into the hospital, ready to save the next life. The story of Claire Sullivan became more than just a viral moment or a feel-good headline. It became a symbol, a rallying cry for nurses and healthcare workers across the country who had spent years being told to follow orders, keep quiet, and never challenge the authority of those above them. Within 6 months of that October afternoon, Sullivan laws began passing in state legislatures protecting medical professionals who acted in good faith during emergencies from retaliatory termination. The culture of fear that had allowed men like Jonathan Blackwood to thrive began to crumble, replaced by something better, a culture of courage. As for Blackwood himself, the investigation that President Mitchell had launched uncovered 14 years of fraud, malpractice, and cover-ups. He was stripped of his medical license, convicted on multiple counts of insurance fraud, and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. But Claire didn't think about Blackwood anymore. She was too busy doing what she had always done, saving lives one patient at a time, refusing to let protocol stand between her and doing what was right. And sometimes late at night, when the hospital was quiet and the emergencies had been handled and there was nothing left to do but wait for the next crisis, Claire would look out the window at the Boston skyline and remember a rainy October afternoon when 2 helicopters had torn through the clouds looking for a nurse with a cardboard box. She would smile, touch the photograph in her pocket, and whisper 4 words that had become her motto, her mission, her reason for getting up every morning. "We don't want the doctor." And that, my friends, is the incredible true story of Claire Sullivan, the nurse who was fired for saving a life only to be swept up by military helicopters and given the chance to save another. It's a story about courage in the face of injustice. It's a story about standing up for what's right, even when the whole world tells you to sit down and follow the rules. But here's what really gets me. Claire wasn't special because she had superpowers or connections or money. She was special because she refused to stop caring, even when caring cost her everything. And that makes me wonder how many Claire Sullivans are out there right now. How many nurses, teachers, firefighters, and everyday heroes are being punished for doing the right thing, just because it made someone powerful look bad? How many people are walking home in the rain with a cardboard box thinking their story is over, when really it's just about to begin? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the unsung heroes in your own life, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, but it tells the algorithm that stories like this matter, that we want to hear about real courage, not just celebrity gossip. And if you haven't already, subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. We've got more incredible tales coming your way. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with a nurse you know. Share it with anyone who's ever been told they were just following orders wrong. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to break the rules to do the right thing? Have you ever been punished for standing up when everyone else stayed silent? What would you have done if you were Claire, standing in that HR office knowing that saving a child's life was about to cost you everything? Your stories matter. I read every single comment. Until the next time, remember, sometimes the cavalry doesn't come on a white horse. Sometimes it comes in a Blackhawk helicopter, looking for the person brave enough to do what needs to be done. Keep fighting the good fight.